I also caught up with Andrew Firman, managing partner and co-founder of Kaleo Ventures, for a view of how international investors are looking at Africa.
If you're viewing everything on sort of equal footing, anything we do in Africa is going to be more risky than the US. I think the approach we want to take is how are we being compensated for that risk? And one of those is obviously going to be a valuation question. In our minds, valuation is a lot more attractive in Africa, even if we adjust for some of those Africa risks that a lot of Western investors see. So yes, in a lot of ways, you take some of those models that, as I said, might be more asset medium or asset heavy. There might be some more inherent risks. However, if we're saying we're adding some risk because of that kind of model, but we're now solving a core problem as opposed to maybe a nice to have solution in Africa, that might actually offset it. Where if you're solving something that people really absolutely need and can't live without, in a way that then that's a lot less risky. So again, we'd encourage investors to have a less binary view. In other words, the US isn't risky, Africa is risky. That's going to lead to a lot of complications down the road. So we would just encourage more of a nuanced view of what risk actually is. And a lot of it comes down to the holistic view, including valuation.
What's been interesting with our newest Africa's 25 startups to watch list is that we've noticed sort of the scales tipping in terms of who the investors are. And we actually found that 26% of the funding has actually been coming from the US, while African investors are actually climbing and now account for 45%. Just considering what you're saying and considering you're sitting in the US, are you seeing maybe sentiment shifting a little bit?
I think there are some structural reasons for that, again, are neither good nor bad. But in the US, you obviously have a lot of homegrown AI that maybe isn't happening to the same extent in Africa. I think that's okay. So I think naturally, I would expect the numbers to show increases in African investors more than US investors, because US investors are just capturing a domestic opportunity that in a lot of ways could be a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. I don't think that's bad for the African ecosystem. A lot of times, when you hear me talk a lot about these really African contextualized problems, it's going to make sense to me that a lot of domestic on-continent investors in Africa are going to understand those problems a little bit faster. They're going to be more willing to back them a little bit earlier. I would still say I do expect a lot of the more blue chip US VCs to still have a high willingness to get involved in Africa once you show that those companies are actually generating solid traction, they're good unit economics, they're creating a product that actually can scale quite well. So what I'd say is in the short term, I'm a little bit less concerned about where those numbers go. I think eventually what we'll see is local African investors, in my view, should be a much higher percentage of that early backing. And then Western investors are going to be a higher percentage of kind of that later stage backing where you're expecting the larger Series B and Series C type VC checks.